Ever wonder why mechanics groan when they see an Ecotec engine roll into the shop? Why a motor that was supposed to revolutionize GM's four-cylinder lineup became synonymous with timing chain rattle and oil consumption? This is the story of how General Motors took a promising engine family and turned it into one of the most notorious reliability nightmares of the 21st century. Picture this. It's 2002. And you're shopping for an economical, compact car. The salesman at your local Chevy dealer is showing you a brand new Cavalier with GM's revolutionary Ecotec engine. This is the future, he tells you. Aluminum construction, dual overhead cams, balanced shafts for smoothness. It's everything those Japanese engines have, but built right here in America. What he doesn't tell you is that in 5 years, you'll be hearing a sound from under your hood that'll make your blood run cold, the death rattle of a timing chain about to send metal shrapnel through your engine. The Ecotec was supposed to be General Motors' answer to Honda's K-Series and Toyota's 2AZFE, a global four-cylinder platform that would power everything from economy cars to performance models across multiple continents. Instead, it became a case study in how cost-cutting, overcomplexity, and corporate denial can destroy an engine's reputation so thoroughly that even the good versions couldn't escape the stigma. To understand how the Ecotec went so wrong, we need to travel back to the late 1990s. General Motors was hemorrhaging market share to Japanese competitors whose four-cylinder engines were lighter, more efficient, and infinitely more reliable than GM's ancient pushrod Iron Duke and Quad 4 designs. The company needed a clean-sheet design that could compete globally. Enter the Ecotec, or, as it was known internally, the L61. The engineering brief was ambitious. Create a modular four-cylinder family that could scale from 1.8 to 2.4 liters, produce competitive power and fuel economy, meet emission standards worldwide, and most crucially, do it all at a lower cost per unit than the competition. That last requirement would prove to be the poison pill that infected everything that followed. When the first Ecotec rolled off the line at GM's Tonawanda engine plant in 2000, it looked impressive on paper. The L61 2.2-liter featured an aluminum block and head, dual overhead cams, 4 valves per cylinder, a composite intake manifold, and counter-rotating balance shafts. Power output was 140 horsepower and 150 pound-feet of torque, respectable for the era. The engine debuted in the 2000 Saturn L Series before spreading to the Chevrolet Cavalier, Pontiac Sunfire, and Saturn Ion. But here's where it gets interesting. While Honda was using a timing chain with an automatic hydraulic tensioner that could last 200,000 miles, GM opted for a cheaper manual tensioner design. The tensioner was supposed to be adjusted during regular maintenance, except GM never put that in the owner's manual. Most owners had no idea their timing chain needed periodic adjustment until it was too late. The first signs of trouble appeared around 40,000 to 60,000 miles. Owners would notice a subtle rattle on cold starts that would disappear once the engine warmed up. This was the timing chain beginning to stretch and the tensioner struggling to maintain proper tension. As the problem worsened, the rattle would persist longer, eventually becoming constant. Then came the catastrophic moment. The chain would jump timing, pistons would meet valves, and what was a running engine seconds before became several thousand pounds of scrap metal. The timing chain wasn't the only Achilles heel. GM specified 5W30 oil with change intervals of up to 10,000 miles under their oil life monitoring system. But the Ecotec's small 4.5-quart oil capacity and marginal PCV system couldn't handle these extended intervals. Oil would break down, form sludge, and block the already narrow oil passages. The variable valve timing solenoids were particularly vulnerable. Once they clogged, valve timing would stick in one position, causing poor performance and eventually damaging the engine internals. Let me put that in perspective. A Honda K20 from the same era held 4.4 quarts of oil, but Honda recommended 5,000-mile change intervals. Toyota's 2AZ FE held 4.6 quarts with similar conservative maintenance schedules. GM was asking their engine to do more with less, and physics doesn't care about quarterly earnings reports. The real nightmare began with the second-generation Ecotec family, particularly the 2.4-liter LE5 that debuted in 2006. This engine powered everything from the Chevrolet Malibu to the Pontiac G6, Saturn Aura, and later the Chevrolet Equinox. On paper, it was an improvement, 169 horsepower initially, later bumped to 182, with variable valve timing on both camshafts. GM even addressed some of the timing chain issues with an improved tensioner design. But GM's engineers had created a new problem that would eclipse everything that came before. The 2.4-liter Ecotec had a fatal flaw in its piston ring design. The oil control rings were too thin and the ring lands too shallow. Under normal operation, the rings would wear prematurely, allowing oil to bypass into the combustion chamber. Engines would start consuming a quart of oil every 1,000 miles, sometimes less. Now here's the kicker. When concerned owners brought their oil-burning Ecotecs to dealers, they were told this consumption rate was within normal specifications. GM's official stance was that burning a quart every 2,000 miles was acceptable. Think about that for a second. With a 4.5 quart capacity, you could theoretically run the engine nearly dry between oil changes. The situation got worse. As rings wore and oil consumption increased, carbon deposits would build up on the piston crowns and valves. The direct injection versions were particularly susceptible. Without fuel washing over the intake valves, carbon would accumulate until valves couldn't seat properly. Compression would drop, misfires would develop, and eventually the engine would need a complete teardown if it hadn't already hydrolocked from oil pooling in the cylinders overnight. Testing showed the problem was worst in specific production years. The 2010 through 2017 2.4-liter engines were the most affected, with some consuming oil from day one. GM knew about the issue. Internal technical service bulletins show they were tracking excessive oil consumption complaints as early as 2011. Their solution? Updated piston rings and a software reflash that didn't actually fix anything, just masked the symptoms by adjusting how the oil life monitor calculated remaining oil life. But wait, there's more. The Ecotec wasn't just plagued by one or two issues, it was death by 1,000 cuts. The water pump, driven by the timing chain, would fail and leak coolant into the oil. The plastic thermostat housing would crack, usually at the worst possible moment. The high-pressure fuel pump on direct injection models would fail, sometimes catastrophically, sending metal shavings through the entire fuel system. Each individual failure might have been forgivable, but together they painted a picture of an engine family that was fundamentally under-engineered. The performance variance should have been the redemption story. The supercharged 2.0-liter LSJ in the Cobalt SS made 205 horsepower, later 260 in the SS turbocharged with the LNF engine. These were genuine performance motors that could embarrass much more expensive European hot hatches. The problem? They were built on the same questionable foundation as their naturally aspirated siblings. The LSJ's Eaton M62 supercharger put enormous stress on the bottom end. Stock connecting rods would bend above 300 horsepower. The ring lands that were already marginal in naturally aspirated form would crack under boost. The LNF turbocharged variant was stronger, but brought its own issues. The direct injection system would carbon up even faster under boost, and the high-pressure fuel pump failures were more frequent and more catastrophic. Tuners discovered these engines responded well to modifications if you replaced literally every internal component. Built LSJ and LNF motors could make 400, 500, even 600 horsepower, but that required aftermarket rods, pistons, valve springs, and usually a built head. At that point, you'd essentially created a new engine that happened to fit in the original block. The packaging made everything worse. GM's transverse engine bay layouts meant accessing the timing chain required removing the engine mount and supporting the engine from above. A timing chain replacement that should cost $500 in parts became a $20,500 job at the dealer. Water pump replacement? That'll be 8 hours of labor because it's buried behind the timing cover. Thermostat? Hope you have small hands and don't mind working blind. This is where GM's cost-cutting became especially cruel. They saved maybe $50 per engine using plastic housings and smaller tensioners, but passed thousands in repair costs onto consumers. A Honda K-Series timing chain is a lifetime component. A Toyota 2AZ FE might need a water pump at 150,000 miles. The Ecotec needed both by 60,000 and probably again by 120,000 if it lasted that long. Let's talk about the lawsuits because there were many. The biggest came in 2014 when GM faced a class action suit covering 2.4-liter Ecotecs in the 2010-2013 Equinox and Terrain, 2012-2013 Regal, and other models. Plaintiffs alleged GM knew about the excessive oil consumption and did nothing. GM eventually settled, offering warranties extensions and reimbursements, but many owners had already junked their cars or paid for repairs out of pocket. Another lawsuit in 2019 targeted timing chain failures in 2.0 and 2.4-liter engines. Plaintiffs presented evidence that GM knew the timing chains were failing prematurely, but continued using the same design for over a decade. Internal documents showed GM engineers had identified the problem and proposed fixes that were rejected due to cost. The human cost was real. Families who bought Malibus and Equinoxes because they needed reliable transportation found themselves with car payments on dead vehicles. Single mothers faced $3,000 repair bills on cars worth $5,000. The Ecotec didn't just fail, it failed the people who could least afford it. So what was actually going wrong at the engineering level? The root cause traced back to GM's modular approach. Instead of optimizing each engine size for its specific application, they tried to make one architecture work for everything. The 2.0 and 2.4-liter versions shared too many components designed for the smaller displacement. Bearing surfaces that were adequate for 140 horsepower weren't sufficient for 180. Oil passages sized for a 2.0-liter couldn't properly feed a 2.4. The variable valve timing system was particularly problematic. GM used a vane-type cam phaser that required consistent oil pressure to function. But with the oil consumption issues, pressure would fluctuate. The phasers would stick, throwing off valve timing and triggering check engine lights. The fix required replacing the phasers, cleaning the oil passages, and updating the ECU software, a $1,500 job that might last another 30,000 miles before failing again. Here's a number that should make you angry. GM sold approximately 1.8 million vehicles with the problematic 2.4-liter Ecotec between 2010 and 2017. If even half experienced excessive oil consumption and the average repair cost was $2,500, that's $2.25 billion in repair costs pushed onto consumers for a problem GM knew about and chose not to properly fix. The tragedy is that not all Ecotecs were bad. The later 2.0-liter LTG turbocharged engine that powers the Camaro and ATS was genuinely excellent, making 272 horsepower reliably with proper oil consumption and timing. Chain longevity. The 1.4-liter turbo in the Cruze and Sonic was reasonably dependable if maintained properly, but by then, the Ecotec name was toxic. Buyers would specifically avoid cars with Ecotec engines, even the good ones. GM's response to the crisis was telling. Instead of a recall or a comprehensive fix, they offered customer satisfaction programs, voluntary repairs that required owners to complain loud enough. They updated piston rings in later production, but never retrofitted the problematic engines already in service. They extended warranties, but made claiming them so difficult that many gave up. The technical service bulletins tell the real story. PIP 5197 addressed oil consumption. PIP 4138A covered timing chain noise. PIP 5331 dealt with carbon buildup. 120371 was for balance shaft bearing failure. Each bulletin represented thousands of failed engines and furious customers. GM knew about every issue and had internal fixes, but getting them to pay for repairs was like pulling teeth. Compare this to how Toyota handled the 2AZ-FE oil consumption issue. When they discovered certain 2007-2009 engines had defective pistons, they issued a warranty enhancement covering the problem for 10 years, regardless of mileage. Affected owners got letters, dealers were proactive about repairs, and Toyota's reputation survived intact. GM's approach was deny, delay, and deflect until forced by lawsuits to act. The aftermarket stepped in where GM failed. Companies like ZZP, Vermont Tuning, and TrickFlow developed upgraded components to address every Ecotec weakness. Forged pistons with properly sized ringlands, billet timing chain tensioners that actually maintained tension, upgraded oil pumps with increased flow. The solutions existed, GM just didn't want to pay for them. Racing teams and tuners proved what the Ecotec could have been. The World Challenge. Touring car Cobalt SS race cars made 350 horsepower reliably for entire seasons. Time attack builders pushed LNF engines past 500 horsepower. With proper components and engineering, the Ecotec architecture was sound. It was the execution that failed. The numbers speak for themselves. A well-maintained Honda K20 routinely sees 200,000 miles without major repairs. Toyota's 2AZ-FE, despite its own oil consumption issues in certain years, typically makes 150,000 to 200,000 miles. The average Ecotec, lucky to hit 100,000 miles without needing major work. Many didn't even make it that far. By 2019, GM quietly retired the Ecotec branding in favor of their new GM Small Gasoline Engine family. The new engines addressed many of the old problems: better materials, improved oil control, more robust timing drives. But the market had long memories. Used car buyers learned to check for that Ecotec badge and walk away. Auto journalists stopped recommending GM four-cylinders entirely. The final insult came in depreciation. A 2013 Malibu with the 2.4 Ecotec depreciated faster than almost any mid-size sedan, losing 70% of its value in 5 years. The same year, Camry retained 50% of its value. That depreciation represented billions in lost wealth for GM customers who thought they were buying reliable transportation. Modern perspective makes the Ecotec failure even more frustrating. GM had the engineering talent. The same company developed the legendary small block V8 and the innovative Voltec hybrid system. They had the resources, spending billions on development. What they lacked was the will to build it right the first time. Every problematic component had a known better alternative that was rejected to save pennies per unit. The Ecotec story is ultimately about trust. When you buy a car, you're trusting that the manufacturer engineered it to last. GM violated that trust repeatedly, knowingly selling engines with fatal flaws while claiming they were normal. They counted on customer ignorance and warranty expiration to protect their bottom line. Today, as GM pivots to electric vehicles with the Ultium platform, they want us to forget the Ecotec era. But the lessons remain relevant. Cost-cutting in critical components, dismissing valid customer concerns, and choosing shareholders over reliability. These patterns could easily repeat in battery management systems and electric drivetrains. The enthusiasts who loved their Cobalt SS and Solstice GXP models deserved better. The families who needed reliable Equinoxes and Malibus deserved better. The GM engineers who fought for proper fixes and were overruled by bean counters deserved better. The Ecotec could have been GM's K-Series, their proof that American manufacturers could build world-class four-cylinders. Instead, it became a cautionary tale about what happens when you prioritize quarterly earnings over engineering excellence. What haunts me about the Ecotec story isn't just the failures, it's the missed opportunity. GM had everything they needed to build a legendary engine family. The architecture was sound, the technology was there, the market was ready. All they had to do was spend the extra $200 per engine to do it right. Instead, they saved that $200 and cost their customers thousands, cost their dealers credibility, and cost themselves a generation of buyers who will never trust a GM four-cylinder again. The Ecotec didn't fail because technology wasn't ready or because engineers didn't know better. It failed because someone in a boardroom decided that good enough was good enough. That timing chains lasting 60,000 miles was acceptable if the warranty was 50,000. That burning oil was normal if you changed the definition of normal. That plastic was fine where metal was needed if it saved 17 cents. In the end, the Ecotec earned its reputation honestly, through hundreds of thousands of failures, billions in damages, and the broken trust of customers who deserved better. It's a reputation that will follow these engines to the junkyard, where many already rest, victims of corporate greed disguised as engineering. What's your worst Ecotec horror story? Drop it in the comments below. And if you're still driving one that hasn't grenaded yet, subscribe for more engineering deep dives. You'll want to know what to watch for. Until next time, check your oil level, listen for that chain rattle, and remember, just because GM says it's normal doesn't mean it is.